Welcome to the Collateral Global podcast. This is Frank Armstrong, who will be your host. I'm interviewing today Toby Green, who himself is often in the hot seat. He is a professor of African history at King's College in London. So a specialist in African history, but in recent times he has been teaching a module on the history of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're here today to do an interview, to interview him about his new book, his latest book, The Heretic of Cacheu, if that's the right pronunciation.
Yeah, that's good. Yes.
Struggles over life in a 17th century West African port, which is published by Alan Lane, which I think is part of the Penguin publishing industry. Toby, was it at all challenging on a personal level to re-immerse yourself in African history, to write this book after engaging so closely with the response to COVID-19?
Thanks, Frank, and yeah, really nice to talk about this with you. And so yes, so just to explain to viewers, listeners, this is a book which is in what you might have called pre-2020 my main academic field. I'm mainly a historian of West Africa in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. That's what almost all my academic work has been on. And then, as you say, and my work on that had been around the history of inequality in that era, the way in which global trade linked to Africa, linked to the transatlantic traffic in Africans, enslaved Africans, contributed to inequalities between Africa and the rest of the Western Hemisphere. So I was already a historian of inequality, and I took that lens into the work I did on COVID. So yeah, and then as you said, I spent 4 years really immersed in that. But so in fact, it was actually a real, almost relief to come back and write this book, because I had actually been about to sit down and write this book in summer of 2020, thinking that, this kind of stuff which started in March is surely coming to an end now, and and then of course that didn't happen, and instead of sitting down to write this book, I then spent 4 years working on COVID, but I had all the material, and it was actually sort of a relief in a way to get back to it, because I guess people, when you're writing about something which happened in the 17th century, it's not so immediate and pressing in its way. I mean, obviously it is, the human lives and the impacts of it are, and we can talk about that later. But at the same time, I felt a slight weight off my back, because certainly working on COVID was an extremely difficult thing to do
For us all, I think.
Yeah.
We'll tease this out further as we go along, but I wonder, were there parallels in your mind regarding what was occurring in Cacheu, where we witness an external colonizing entity attempting to exert ideological conformity, and what happened in Africa during the period of COVID?
Yeah, so of course, one of the interesting things I think for me about this book is that it certainly is a different book to the book I would have written had I sat down and written it in the summer of 2020, because my perspective on the way in which colonialism operates has changed, because obviously you see it in many different ways in our society, but seeing it in such a stark way during the COVID pandemic and the impacts it has had, which we can perhaps talk about later, gave me a different sense, I think, of how a different way to look at the materials I drew on to write the book. And so I certainly do see parallels between, yes, and external institutions coming in, trying to shape social structures, economic and religious outcomes in a way which is not to the benefit of the people who are living there. And that is surely the definition of colonialism. And we saw that the book is about that. And we just experienced that over the last few years.
Although I suppose people might observe that the figurehead of the WHO, at least, was from Africa. And
Yes, Ghebreyesus, former Minister of Health in Africa, in Ethiopia, and also, former one of the leaders of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which was basically a Stalinist movement in Ethiopia, in the north of Ethiopia in the 25 years ago. So yes, indeed, there is an African leader at WHO, but seeing as most people on the African continent are not Stalinists, we cannot question how far that was to the continent's benefit.
indeed, and I suppose the view in Africa would be that the WHO is not an African organization, and doesn't perhaps have Africa's interests at heart.
I think that would certainly be the view among the vast majority of Africans. It wouldn't be the case necessarily in the institutional areas. And, WHO has its own subsidiaries, WHO Africa, CDC Africa, and, they produce a lot of work around, public health on the continent. And, there's a lot of work which goes into that. But as I think happens increasingly, not only on the African continent, actually, but around the world, there is very much a disconnect between what is happening at an institutional level in procedure and process and what is happening in people's experience of daily life.
Mm. So in any case, you chose to keep this connection implicit rather than explicit. Do you think if the connections had been explicit, it would have alienated some of your readership?
You mean the connections between the past and the present in that way?
Well, but yes, and your own views
Like,
on what happened during the pandemic. Would that have? I mean, are your contemporaries in African history or sort of policy making, are they receptive to your ideas?
well, the curious thing about the work I've done in the last few years on COVID is that, I've never had more colleagues who I work with in very close ways on the continent of Africa. In fact, we've just had an article accepted in one of the flagship journals of African studies on the COVID pandemic response, which is co-authored by two really senior colleagues in academia in Africa, on the African continent, and a colleague also here in the UK. So I've been working extremely closely with a lot of scholars of different kinds: medicine, sociology, history, economics, history of medicine, all kinds of fields in Africa. But my relationship with the field of African studies in the West has kind of become a little bit semi-detached. Not entirely, but I mean, I've got a lot of colleagues still who I'm very close to, but at the same time, certainly more semi-detached than it was. So that's a curiosity. I mean, I think somebody who works in the field of African history, if they're working with a lot of people on the continent of Africa, that must be a good thing. So I'm probably, I would say, doing something right. But on the other hand, would the readership of this book, which, as you say, is published in the West, necessarily appreciate that? Not necessarily. And they all know what I think. And they can read into, and as we will discuss probably, it's hard to read the book and not read that into it. But at the same time, I didn't feel it needed to be articulated. The last chapter is about, as you know, is about health and disease. There's a clear relationship. I would draw a clear relationship between what happened in the 17th century and the emergence of medicine as a form of colonial practice from Western empires. So, I think it didn't. I would say it didn't really need to be any more explicit than that. Really.
Mm. So in any case, you haven't been cancelled, but nor has your book been maybe reviewed in the New York Times as your previous book was, or maybe you're a little less feted over this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. So my previous book on African history, as you say, Frank, was the word feted is kind of a fair one. I mean, I think that, but any writer really should ignore reviews, because if somebody says your book's great and I think, oh, my book's great. Is that a good thing? Probably not.
Well, it's perhaps a good thing for sales.
It may be a good thing for sales and, writing future books, which obviously is true, but it's not a good thing for me as a writer to go around thinking, oh, I must be great now because all these people say that I am. And similarly, if, one of the reviews that I'm most proud of in my life actually was a review of a book I wrote in 2004, which was absolutely pilloried in the TLS. And I remember thinking at the time, what if I've really annoyed this person so much? There must be something to it, or there must be something of interest there. So, similarly, you shouldn't be just totally downcast if you get terrible reviews. And so, as you say, I haven't actually had many reviews for the book. You very kindly wrote one in Cassandra Voices, and there was a review in the Telegraph, there was a review in History Today, there was a review in Literary Review. So it has had a few reviews, but I think there are various reasons for that. I don't know if I could really just attribute that to my work on COVID. I think various things have happened in the last 5 years, which mean that, in general, I've heard this from a number of people. The kind of non-fiction which this book represents is harder to find space for in newspapers because we face so many crises that things which are more current. Immediately apparently current obviously take precedence. So I think that that's another factor.
So it's not censorship by omission then?
I think, I really would be going down a paranoid route to demand, the similar, no, I think I wouldn't say so.
Okay, well, moving on to the book itself. So the Heretic of Cacheu, who was the heroine, or anti-hero?
Protagonist. Yeah.
Protagonist.
So one of the things which I think is unusual about this book, and unusual about the material, the historical sources I was able to draw on to write this book, is that this is in some ways a sort of biographical account of the life of an African woman from the 17th century. So the Heretic of Cacheu was a woman called Crispina Perez, whose mother was from the Guinea-Bissau region. Father was Portuguese, so she was mixed heritage, but she was brought up in an African environment. She saw very little of her father. She was brought up by her mother and her mother's mother. She didn't speak Portuguese, so she had to be ahead of an interpreter in her in the materials we have. And she became one of the most powerful traders in the town of Cacheu. So Cacheu was the largest slave trafficking port in the 17th century in this part of West Africa, in what's now Guinea-Bissau. She became one of the most powerful traders. She was obviously involved in that traffic. She was also involved in all kinds of different business, and her house was a magnet for people from around the region. So because of her enemies, and because she was so influential, her enemies conspired against her and denounced her to the Inquisition for practices which they said were heretical. And so because of that, we have an enormous amount of evidence in her Inquisition trial. So she was eventually actually arrested and deported to Lisbon from Guinea-Bissau, from Cacheu, and she spent 3 years in the jail there in Lisbon, and we have the trial record. So it's a remarkable historical document which allows you to reconstruct many aspects of daily life in this distant time and place.
Okay, so there's also reference in the book to the djabakós. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly. Traditional healers.
Djabakós. Yes.
Djabakós.
Djabakós. Yes.
Which were considered a great challenge to the colonial authorities. Why was this the case?
So this is an important part of the book. So what Crispina Perez was denounced for to the Inquisition, and she was arrested for, was her relationship with the djabakós, with these healers, and she recounts in rather a moving way how she had turned to the healers because her child was very ill. She hoped that they might be able to heal her, and she then says, and then in the end her child died, and as she put it, after that her heart grew small, which is very moving. And you sort of, you don't often have materials which speak to somebody's emotions in that way from such a long time ago. And anyhow, the Inquisition saw this as heretical because the djabakós practiced African well, they had knowledge of medicinal healing from from the Senegambian environment, but also they were not Catholic. They were some of them were Muslim, and some of them practiced African religions, and some of them practiced both. And the Inquisition was able to arrest people on suspicion of heresy if they were baptized Catholics, but were seen to be not practicing Catholicism in an orthodox fashion in some way, which was contrary to the doctrine of Catholicism. So the Jabakós, through their effectively, was a sort of threat to imperial power. So the fact that, and what turns out in the trial is that, in fact, all of the people who accused Crispina Pérez also used the skills of the Jabakós. Because, of course, if you were in Cacheu in the 17th century, you turn to the people who might have some knowledge of, medicine, the herbs which were found in the environment, the way that they've been used for a long time to treat various ailments, and Western medicine had no knowledge at all about any of these things. And so everybody was using the Jabakós, all of the people. But of course, this is one of the things I try and tease out in the book, that actually in many ways this represented a real challenge to imperial ambitions, because empire was an economic project and it was a political project, but it was also an ideological project. In order to get people to go along with, or to not go along is the wrong word. In order to coerce people into this framework, there was also the importance of producing an ideological system which would somehow be dominant. And so if people are turning away from imperial systems of knowledge and ideas about the relationship of the body of human beings to the world around them, and are turning to the Jabakós, who represent Senegambian views of the relationship of human beings to the world around them and Senegambian religious practices, that is a challenge to the way in which empire is trying to develop itself in the 17th century. So the Jabakós is a very key figure in the book, and also the way in which the Jabakós also and also another important thing to add, actually, is that Jabakós were not just men. There were many women who were also Jabakós and healers, and in fact, many of the medical practitioners in the final chapter of the book who are listed in the records we have were women. So this is an important part. There's a big gender dimension to the book, as our guest is coming across, and that also, of course, was a threat to empire, because the Portuguese Empire by the 17th century was an intensely patriarchal system. So all of this was at play, basically. So there are many different symbolic aspects to the trial of this woman.
I'm reminded of how I think is he one of Cambridgeshire's sons, Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell?
Yes, he's from Ely. Yes, that's right.
He contracted malaria at a certain point and refused to take quinine, which which was referred to as the Jesuits' bark at the time, and was associated with Catholicism. So even within Europe, there were sort of various taboos that operated around.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. It's around medicine and whose medicine it was.
Yeah, and associations that were made. And are these Jabakós, is this a term that's still in use today in the region?
Yes, Jabakós is still, it is a term still in use, and and many Guineans, and of course this brings us back to the question of the use and experience of modern medicine in Guinea-Bissau, that part, or parts of Africa today, because if people have enough money, they certainly would go and buy anti-malarials, Quinimax, for instance, or other kinds of antimalarials if they come down with a malarial infection. But there are but it's expensive to go often, to have prolonged courses of treatment. It's expensive, and so people will often also go to African healers and prescribing remedies which have been used for maybe many centuries at times in there. So this is something which is very current.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me, having I visited Sierra Leone, which is, I think, in that
yes, it's
Senegambian
that region.
which just at the end of the Ebola crisis, and huge amounts of money were pouring in from around the world, particularly from the UK in the case of Sierra Leone,
Yeah.
which was accompanied by a rise in authoritarianism, actually, because COVID, not because COVID, because Ebola allowed the police forces to stop any vehicle and test
Yeah.
anybody on the street, walking
Oh,
by
yeah.
or driving by,
Mm.
to see whether they had any symptoms of Ebola,
Mm.
as in a high temperature.
Mm.
And obviously native practices would have been very sort of circumscribed in that period. So obviously it has a contemporary resonance beyond COVID even.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the reason for that is in between, the 17th century and the 21st century, of course, we had colonialism in the 20th century, and that was very much, medicine in the colonial era was very much connected to controlling African bodies, bodies of African subjects. So, there were various examples of that you could give, oral polio vaccine trials in Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda in the 1950s, where literally millions of Africans were given trial vaccinations without any kind of
Consent.
any kind of consent or ethics being taken place,
Mm.
and various examples that you give of various projects which are completely authoritarian, top down, and in some ways, and often actually quite counterproductive. In fact, there are various examples of that. The medical historian from France, France Bernot, wrote a really interesting article about this in June 2020 about the way in which colonial interventions had attempted to control disease outbreaks in the colonial period, and how often they'd been completely counterproductive, and so that means that the idea, and it really was extraordinary, I think, during COVID, that in the kind of what we might call the liberal press, there was still this narrative going on about vaccine apartheid, and basically, yes. So Western medical interventions were going to be the savior of not only of the West, but also of Africa, and that anybody, and that this was something we should all get behind without any kind of sense of the history of medicine, and how Western medicine is perceived in Africa, which really is extraordinary that was, the major narrative which most people on the liberal left got behind.
Well, we could go down that rabbit hole, but
yeah,
let's
we could, yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
say that at times in Cacheu, the health of the body and the spirit were seen as integrated, and thus healing the body also required healing the spirit. Do you think that this view has any application to today's health challenges? For example, the scourge of loneliness that we now face, particularly in the wake of the lockdowns in our own countries.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think we all know in different ways. It's almost an unspoken epidemic, I would say. I think many of us know people who've been extremely horrendously affected in psychic terms by the different kinds of experiences. We probably all know people who we feel for one reason or another, or know, in fact, I mean, I know people who've taken their own lives. I mean, so we all know people who've had these experiences, and clearly health is a complex thing. Obviously there is certainly a reductive physical component to it, and clearly when you're facing a medical crisis, that's instantly what society will turn to address. But it doesn't take long for the other aspects of health to move from the background into the foreground. And I mean, that clearly happened during the pandemic. Had these policies been rolled out in an initial panic, and then after 2 or 3 months, people said, okay, well, now we know more or less what we're dealing with, which was the case, who is most at risk, which was the case, so we need to stop making such harmful interventions for the rest of society. Then I think obviously the cumulative damage that was done would have been far less. And so, yes, I think there is an afterlife of that experience, which is clearly impacting whole swathes of society. And we can come up with policy also, or governments can come up with policies which address the physical, but they also need to. We as a society, we need to reflect on how that relates to people's own personal experience of this time, which isn't just a physical question.
Yeah, I mean, just I suppose there were the tactic was to stress people, to make them distressed, and that has physical ramifications in terms of the kind of hormones that we secrete in our bodies, and and that leads to choices about what we eat or how we sleep, and all of these things. So it's an important point. You also make the interesting point that periods of crises and the collapse of an existing socio-political culture are often accompanied by disease, alluding to the alcoholism that emerged in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union. Would you connect the ongoing high levels of excess deaths and declining life expectancy in our own countries to an unraveling, at least, of our existing socio-political culture?
I would. I think everybody is aware that something changed during COVID, and the ways people relate to each other, more home working, the class dimensions of that, which aren't usually discussed, but obviously that tends to suit older and wealthier people more than younger people, and the way that young people might experience that if they're now, as some young people I know are, living in quite small flats, spending the whole day staring at screens, doing their work at home. There are whole dimensions to how this will affect people's health, which is symbolic, I think, of the way in which the social contract changed in some way, shifted in some way, and some people felt it was broken in some way. And we know that as well in Britain, for instance, with increasing absenteeism from school, and very little that seems to be able to be done about that. And all of that is to say that this is going to have impacts on terms of life expectancy, and in terms, you mentioned stress. Stress is known to be a contributor to risk factors of heart disease, for instance. So, and cancer as well. So, clearly, yeah, and this is one of the sad things I think about the fallout of the pandemic in terms of critics of pandemic policies, because far too many of those critics have taken a very very reductive view of health in the end. Some of them, a number of them, as we know, have gone down kind of anti-vax frameworks, and without remembering what they felt at the start, which was very much around health as a holistic thing, and so when we look at excess mortality, that I think should be the starting point. Health is holistic. Various contributing factors, yes, physical factors, but also social, emotional, and psychological factors, and that does seem to me to be entirely relevant to the excess death that we're seeing.
And I suppose, how do you have any view on how we might raise people's health? Are there? I mean, to talk more positively. I mean, we're obviously getting a little bit away from the book itself, but are there, or maybe we can learn from contemporary or even historic African societies about how we can raise our own health and raise our own spirits. Do you have any views on that?
I think, yes. I mean, I'm a great believer in being outside. I mean, unfortunately, the job I do doesn't allow me to be outside as much as I'd like to be. But I like you, Frank, I'm a vegetable gardener, and
Don't give that away.
well, it's too late. It's too late. But I think that. Clearly that's a challenge in many urban environments. Although, of course, in the African continent, it's important to make the point that, in fact, even in urban environments, people spend most of their time outside, because obviously living conditions inside may not be great. So, that's an interesting point to observe, which also, this is in parentheses, was one of the reasons why lockdowns were so completely pointless in Africa, because anyway, don't need to go into that.
Yeah, and I suppose another observation about Africa that you often hear is that people seem quite happy, often happier despite difficult material circumstances. Not in
Yes,
every case, of course,
I
but
mean, it's hard to generalize that there.
yeah,
I mean, yes, in some ways, but conditions have been very challenging, and I think
of
I
course,
think in my experience, a lot of this would have to do with a political environment. So, for example, one of my oldest friend, in fact, on the African continent is Alaji, who made Mamadou, who made some of the films actually for Collateral Global, on Senegal, daily life in post-pandemic Senegal, and so I've known Alaji for 30 years, and so during and immediately after the COVID, there was a very authoritarian government in Senegal, Macky Sall's government, and people really felt under the cosh of that. And although Macky Sall left power, in early 2024, and although materially things haven't changed very much, the fact of not living in that environment has, according to my friend, made a big difference to how people feel on a daily basis. So I think, and of course we can reflect on that in our own experience. Obviously, that was, to a different degree, perhaps, but certainly the authoritarian frameworks which came into liberal democracies in 2020 and 2021 did feel, for a number of people, oppressive, and certainly that's going to have an impact on how people are doing. So, all that's to say that I think the political context is probably quite key to how people feel about their lives.
yeah. And you can still feel it in Central and Eastern Europe, the legacy of communist dictatorships
Well, in fact,
there.
I do remember, because of course there are a number of people from a lot of people from Eastern Europe living in Britain, and during 2020 and 2021, I met a number of them in various contexts who said, it reminded them of what it was like to live under communism, so they were not happy about it.
Yeah, a friend of mine likened living in Ireland to living in East Germany. Such was the level of propaganda and surveillance.
Yeah.
Any case, can you talk a little about the impact of the transatlantic slave trade and ensuing colonization on African societies in this region? Did the slave trade cause indigenous civilizations to collapse, even if the populations didn't die out, as in the Americas?
Whew, that's a sort of massive question, isn't it, Frank? Yeah. Well, so I mean, the first thing to say is, clearly one of the things you can see in the history of Africa is the enormous resilience of Africans and their ability to reshape their own societies in extremely stressful and often violent situations, often brought on by outside forces. So African societies were not somehow destroyed. There wasn't there was a demographic impact, so we need to be no doubt about that, and there's been some quite interesting work done on that. So of course, one of the difficulties with the data of the transatlantic slave trade, so there's a database, for example, called slavevoyages.org, which tries to produce what it would call an objective view of the demographic impact of the traffic, and it estimates around 12 million Africans were captured and enslaved and embarked in Africa for the Americas. But of course, one of the problems with this statistic is that it doesn't take any account of the comparative demographics. What was the world population like in 1600? Well, actually, it was about 1/15 of what it is today. So to really understand that figure, you'd have to times that by 15 to get a sense of the comparative impact of that on the African continent. That's over 3 centuries. But then, of course, there are other factors to take into account, like, the age. So there was a particular premium placed by slave traffickers on young men, who, of course, generally, so that's going to have a massive demographic impact itself if you're, capturing and exporting large numbers of young men. And then large numbers of people died en route to trafficking ports. And so there's a whole lot of things which is not kind of captured by that statistic at all. This is kind of left out. So it seems objective, but is actually completely decontextualized. So the context is really important to understand the impact of that. And I think, many, as I am an economic historian, and a number of economic historians, and there's a great Nigerian economic historian called Joseph Inikori, and really the argument would be that what really the real impact of all this in Africa was an economic one as well as much as well as a human one, in that, if you over the long period of time kind of deprive a continent of such a large number of young people who have a huge amount of creativity and agency, that's going to have a massive long-term impact on socioeconomic well-being. And that, so, I think that would be the fundamental thing to take away about the impact of the transatlantic slave traffic over the long term on the continent, which clearly has a massive impact on economic inequalities, obviously, to this day. And so in terms of what that might mean and about daily life in Cacheu when at the time when this book is set, so clearly, Crispina Perez was involved in the slave trade, and many of the people who emerge in the documents were also involved in it. On the other hand, it wasn't, as so often happens, as we know from our own experience of the world, terrible things can be happening and people can try to turn a blind eye to it. So there was still a framework of daily life happening in spite of that. That captives were coming from outside Cacheu. They were being brought from other regions. Usually they would have been captured in wars, or criminality in some way or other. So in that sense, not too dissimilar to what happened to convicts going to Australia, for instance. And then they were coming to Cacheu, where they were being kept in the separate kind of fortified houses. And on the other hand, there was, market life, crops being grown and products coming into be sold to the ships, for instance, because obviously the captives had to be fed on the crossing. And then there are all kinds of crafts associated with a busy port town. There were carpenters, there were coopers who made barrels, there were tailors. So it's a very complex picture.
And one point you made was that women became more powerful because of so many men being removed from that society.
Yes.
And also, I couldn't help observing that Crispina herself was not exactly angelic in her treatment of human chattel, and there's an account
enslaved
of
members of her household. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
And
she's a complex figure. She's a complex figure. She is, a slave trader. She says in her own testimony that you couldn't rely on any of the testimony of her own slaves because she treated them so cruelly. And so it's a very complex situation. I mean, of course, in the end, powerful people, in some way or other, tend to represent aspects of the societies that, of their contexts. Cacheu was a city, was a town, a small town, not a city. It was a small town, based on whose economic life grew out of the transatlantic traffic. So it was going to be a place where there wasn't a lot of cruelty. That doesn't mean that the rest of the region was completely caught up with that. There were other things going on there as well. There was a lot of weaving. Weaving was a major craft and economic activity in many small towns and villages around the region, just to give one example. So, I mean, as a historian of this time and place, one of the real difficulties and complexities is, on the one hand, there's a long history in the West of reductively associating the history of Africa with the history of slavery. And that in itself is quite problematic, because also obviously lots of other things are happening. There's beautiful arts and crafts being produced. There's, musical innovations happening actually at the same time here. And yet, on the other hand, of course, if you simply don't address that, you're missing out a fundamental aspect of both the time and place itself and of the long-term impacts this has had on the African continent. So it's a complex balance, and something it's probably impossible to get completely right, but we try. People who work in
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm currently reading a book called Rot, about the Irish famine,
Right.
Which obviously there are great differences, but there's a similar sort of cycle of emigration, or not emigration, forced emigration, or
Yeah.
slavery, but also indentured labor prior to that in Ireland. And
Yeah.
but there's a tendency, I suppose, to look at Irish history purely in the context of the famine, whereas actually there were many things going on
It was happening long before.
simultaneously,
Yes.
and not everyone was affected, or not,
And of
and everyone
course,
wasn't
the
affected
other is
equally.
interesting to make that comparison, because of course there's the demographic impact on Ireland as well, which was
Sure,
very,
and the other
yeah,
thing in
yeah.
Ireland that people don't like to observe is that actually some people did quite well out of it, and similarly, presumably in Africa, people like Crispina
Well, I mean,
were.
that's why a lot of the most read historians of this history today, like for example, the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney wrote a famous book in 1972, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But his analysis was mainly around, actually, was a lot of it was to do with class. That effectively this was an alliance of European and African elites at the expense of
Yeah,
the African poor. And clearly, if you look at the neo-colonialism and how that's played out, you can see that that's an analysis which has a lot of legs with it.
I suppose the comprador class, as they've been called elsewhere. Yeah. So you write that historically, those who diagnose the condition in the first place are generally those then empowered to claim the authority to heal it. Considering
Yeah.
the damage done by COVID policies to Africa in particular, where few among a young population died from the disease itself, would you argue that Africa needs to adopt health policies today that might diverge from the interests of Western governments and Western agencies or companies?
Well, absolutely, I would. And actually, I just want to make it clear. Actually, I mean, I thought this is actually something which a friend of mine, a Ghanaian friend, a historian of medicine, who I've worked with quite a bit on this, and actually interviewed for Collateral Global, Samuel Adujamfi, said to me, and it really stuck with me, because I think if you look at the history of medicine, this is very true. And in fact, if you look at the history of COVID, it's very true. The very people who who analyzed the DNA of COVID and came up with a diagnosis, are also some of the people who then invested and financed the vaccination program to cure or treat COVID. So we can see this in many different ways in our societies and histories, and actually says something more broad, I think, about the sociology of medicine, and the way in which, on the one hand, medical professionals in all societies, so however accurate their diagnoses and prescribed cures may be, have always had a powerful role. So I think one of the things I've reflected on in the last few years is that some of the outrage which was found in sections of what we might call the alt-right around COVID was based on a kind of fundamental misapprehension around, the history of medicine. The idea that somehow medicine has always been there in a kind of Pollyanna-ish way, as everything is always kind of for the best possible outcome and the best possible reasons, doesn't take account of the fact that this power relationship has always been there in medicine, and the important thing has actually been to prescribe a cure and to get that cure accepted, however effective it is. And we can see that in COVID as well. There's absolutely no reason why Western societies should be any different in that regard to any other societies worldwide. So I found that a very perceptive observation by Samuel Adujamfi, and so yes, when you look at current health paradigms, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that and a number of people on the continent said this to me. One of the things that COVID really made clear was just how far Africa needs to go its own way. Can't rely on anybody or anything really anymore for more beneficial outcomes.
I
And
suppose one wouldn't want to take that to too much of an extreme, and throw various babies out with various bathwaters, and say, I mean, obviously there are some of the programs, some of the development and medicinal programs are obviously beneficial,
Yeah.
And I suppose for the West to walk away from Africa would not be a good thing either.
It's very complicated. So here's an
Yeah.
example. Here's an example I could give you. You know, I had a funny experience recently where I ended up sitting next to somebody who's very senior in one of the large medical funding agencies in the world, and we're talking about the impacts of Trump's policies and the cuts to US aid, for instance. So what's that meant in practice? What it meant in the particular example he gave me, I won't say where the country was, but there is an African country where a program was cut to at the cost of $600 million from US aid. And what had happened was that various funders had stepped in with $200 million to make up the shortfall, and the African country was expected to stump up $400 million to make up the rest of it, so that the program could continue going. So the question then arises: okay, so this may well have been a valuable program, but $600 million is a hell of a lot of money in any African country, or any country actually, and how beneficial it is. I mean, you then have to start doing the kind of discussion you might have around the COVID interventions. You know, like in the UK context, okay, we spent 37 billion pounds on track and trace, which is the entire national transport budget, or 30 hospitals more or less. Maybe we'd have been better off building 30 hospitals, or, you know, okay, $400 million on this program. I'm sure it might be helpful, but maybe we could spend that on something else which would be more helpful, you know. So that's where you start.
Conventional health economics were thrown under the bus
in such an extraordinary way, but in a sense,
it's kind of mind-boggling. And I don't think anyone has really faced up to that, or is willing to do so.
I mean, funnily enough, actually, Frank, you know, you mentioned, you know, you kindly published a couple of weeks ago my response to the debate I participated in Oxford in November. And at the outset, the chair said, well, you know, the COVID inquiry, you know, it's most expensive in British history. It's £192 million so far. And my initial response was, well, no, it's a lot of money, but it's many orders of magnitude less than the response to COVID itself, which we don't even talk about, you know, which is estimated to be around £370 billion.
And well, the fundamental flaw of that inquiry was that they didn't look at the epidemiological evidence on which all these decisions were based. You know, so suddenly they're selectively reporting the Imperial College belief, projection, whatever you want to call it, voodoo, that 20,000 extra lives could have been saved by lockdown, and really without analyzing any alternative views or projections, which might have been equally valid and might have been better based on better,
of course, the whole thing
models.
It's a counterfactual, you know. I mean, and if you look at, and if you step away and look at the comparative evidence from other countries around the world, it's hard to sustain that case. But
okay, well, let's move on now to the penultimate question. The Inquisition, which we often refer to as the Spanish Inquisition, but obviously it was far more than a Spanish Inquisition, was a secretive organization that exercised authority behind the scenes. Do you think that some of these tendencies or approaches endure among those who operate within transnational organizations today?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do. But then I think, again, I would say there's a certain kind of, you know, some criticisms of, and we discussed this before, Frank, when we met, but some of these criticisms, again, have a slightly, they misrepresent the history of politics and power. I mean, so, you know, the Nobel Prize winning writer Elias Canetti, in his famous book Crowds and Power, wrote a lot about how power is always connected to secrecy, and we can connect that to many world societies. You know, it's not just the case in, you know, in Britain today. It's you know, government reports, documents are secret for 20 years before they're officially released. All political parties sign up to that. Nobody objects to it.
there are good reasons for that.
And there
I
are
mean,
good reasons for it. And
yeah.
secrecy, and in West Africa, actually, what colonial officials called secret societies in Sierra Leone and
Hmm.
Liberia were important holders of power and keepers of power within their societies. And we could give many other examples where
Yeah.
secrecy has been part of power. So I think, yes. And the Inquisition is, what you could say about the Inquisition is it's a very early institution worldwide where the markers of kind of institutional power can be seen, and working across, as you say, actually transnationally, although it's thought of as a Spanish institution, but it actually worked across the Spanish Empire in Latin America, and the Portuguese Inquisition worked in Goa as well as in Africa. And yes, the secrecy was at the core of the Inquisition, and that's because of the role secrecy has in retaining power of various kinds. But its institutionalization in the Inquisition was a very early example of that. And yes, it clearly is very marked today in the transnational organizations which have become so influential. And well, of course, but of course, I think one of the problems that in a way that kind of authority has today is precisely that hold over information has broken down. So WikiLeaks, for instance, Assange, one of the things, perhaps you could argue, and I did argue in a recent article in Unheard, that one of the real causes of the, vituperative response to him by the establishment was the way in which that was a challenge to their control over information.
Certainly. And I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said about that, and about the balance, I suppose, that for when it comes to secrecy, we wouldn't be able to have so many of the discussions that occur. Would be very difficult if there wasn't a bit of confidentiality applied, and people couldn't speak freely, and people would be constantly watching what they said, and it would be very unsatisfactory. So obviously there are circumstances where people need to, there needs to be an agreement, some agreement that things are confidential.
Yeah, unfortunately, I broke it about the vegetable gardening, but
the secret is out.
The secret is out. Yeah.
So well, then finally, are you working on another book? And if so, can you tell us anything about it?
I am working on 2 books. So one of them is a short history of Africa, which I'm writing with a colleague in the Gambia, exhumes, and which we're nearly finished. And the other is a book out of the conference, which Daniel was involved in filming, actually, at King's College London 2 years ago. And so we're publishing a book in Aleida Mendes Borges, who I co-organized that with, and one of the people who came, Sundararaman from India. We're co-editing a book about that, coming out from that in Bloomsbury's International Development Series, which they've told us should be out by August or so. So we're just putting that through its final paces. So I'm still trying to keep both aspects of my
foot in both camps.
That's it.
Okay. Well, I think that brings us to a conclusion. And thank you, Toby, for this interesting conversation, which moved almost unseamlessly between African history and contemporary concerns. And actually, I think we can obviously draw lessons from history and discover more about ourselves through it.
Yeah.
And so I think thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Frank.